And it seems like we've got a volunteer. Nathan?
Yep. Hey, I'm Nathan Long. I'm currently doing a master's by research, which is using a swarm of autonomous boats to estimate sea states. I'm about a year in now. Cheers.
Excellent.
Hi, I guess I'll go next. Yeah, I'm Tim. I'm doing my undergraduate, and I'm kind of interested because I'm part of a society called FluroSat at UNSW, and we mostly do satellite technology, especially in regards to agriculture.
Excellent. Would love to hear more about it. Who's next?
Hi, I'm here as Nick, but my name is Peter Nicholson. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you, Peter.
Okay, I'm a retired senior Air Force officer. I research in strategic affairs, particularly in the security domain. And I've been long interested in ISR, especially from overhead assets.
Okay, awesome. Thank you. Jackie, Michael, Cole, have a few of you can still chat to us.
Hi everyone, my name's Cole. I chair the University of Sydney student branch. So keen to be at this Sydney section event. Thank you, Anastasia, for being here as well. Very keen to hear what you have to speak about. I'm studying mechatronic engineering and physics at the University of Sydney. And yeah, very passionate about drones and their applications for a smart society.
Hi, Jackie Carpenter. Most of you probably don't know who I am, but Anastasia does. I'm the Managing Director of One Giant Leap Australia. We do a lot of R&D drone stuff. We run a model aircraft field out here in Western Sydney that some people frequent from Uni of New South Wales and Sydney Uni. We do a lot of space stuff. And we pretty much our focus is STEM and STEM careers and trying to help people get internships. We do one trip to the States every year, and we take whoever wants to come with us on an amazing, life-changing trip. So if you want to know any more about One Giant Leap Australia, just let me know. But it's great, Anastasia, to see you, and I'm excited to hear about the developments of where you're at.
Awesome. Thanks, Cole. Thanks, Jackie. We've got a few more people. Would love to get a representative sample of all of you, because there's only 8 of us. We run a virtual agronomy course lately for the last 6 weeks, and we have welcomed our 500th sign up. So when we have 8 people, I would love to hear from all of you.
Hi, Anastasia. I'm Nimish here. So I'm running the section for this year. And the thing is, even though we have 8 people, the US has shown keen interest. So even though this session might just have 8, we do have people who view this recording later on. So we had Dan Dumbacker, who's the AIAA chairman. He has shown interest, and he also views the recordings once we put them up. So it gets straight up to the level, just letting you know.
Yeah, that's fine. I mean, it still has to be tailored to the audience. I mean, I'm in the US and I'm viewing this live. Okay, guys, I think I won't convince anyone else to join unless, I guess, Nathan and Michael decide to speak if they have their microphones. Nathan?
Yep, already.
That's right. Sorry. I've got you. I'm sorry. I lost your video. This is why I assumed, because you jumped to the back of the list. I'm sorry.
No worries.
Let's go. All right, let's get rolling. This is what I think. Okay, well, thank you so much for having me. It's good to hear someone saying AIAA and someone saying University of Sydney. Those things ring a few bells in my head. We will be pretty much fluid today. There is a number of things that we can talk about when it comes to personal people's journeys and careers, I guess. Nimish has suggested a couple of points and topics that I can cover, but please think about questions. I will pause at certain points in time when I guess I'm comfortable to give you the opportunity to ask me questions, because this is supposed to be useful. We're all investing the time to learn, exchange experience, ask questions, share, connect. So let's make sure it's useful for all of us for those applications. So first of all, my name is Anastasia. I am the CEO and founder of FluroSat. FluroSat is a crop monitoring and decision support provider for agriculture. I'm currently in the US. We are a global company. We have users in 14 countries. And as I mentioned, we have been recently running the virtual agronomy webinar course that actually attracted people from 65 countries. So I definitely do have a global perspective on the use of technology and would like to share it. But I guess since it's an AIAA focused webinar today, I'll speak more to my career progression and cover some broad topics like how did I get into startups, what are the do's and don'ts, my suggestions, I guess, on how you can think about your career as an engineering student, as a master's student, and I guess later on I'll also touch on other things like, you know, what you can do as a first step, but this is just something that we brainstormed with Mish. Some additional points I'll add to it as well, so feel free to add so it's more focused on what you want to hear. So I guess you can just open my LinkedIn. I can share a link to it, but I'm opening it now to tell you a story of how I've become who I am. And on the kind of academic side, that obviously all of us have to a certain extent, I have 2 masters in aerospace. One of them is kind of with more major in avionics. I have one of those masters out of Ukraine, second master's in Poland when I moved to do my master's there. At the time that I was doing my master's, I was thinking of what to do next. And I was able to commercially try myself out, as well as see the opportunities to do higher degree by research, which Sydney Uni became my new alma mater for my PhD, and that's the university I associate myself with the most, having spent the most, I guess, formative years as a young professional doing my PhD there. So we can talk about my research, but I think the most important part is how it feeds into the startup experience and how it feeds into commercial experience. And I will start by touching on a few points that I often get asked about. So to me, the journey that you can have academically and the journey that you can have professionally is not a completely separate story. It's still one of you. And it's one story that you make out of those maybe more or less disparate threads. So when I was in my master's in parallel, I was working back in my bachelor's, and I'm sure everyone as a student, as a young professional, has odd jobs here and there, but I wanted to figure out what I would like to do, and I started the aviation university in Kiev regionally, my bachelor's. Not because I was so passionate about aviation. I mean, I love planes, I love flying, but I wasn't necessarily seeing myself as someone who will get into a turbine and wants to know everything about it. That turned out to be a fascinating experience when I got to do that 6 years later in my master's in Poland, when That was actually the lab aerospace engines that we could do. But the journey wasn't that glamorous, and people often think, oh, you know, everyone who's successful has this vision and they go from a step to step and they finally achieve their end goal that they've envisioned all along. Whilst I actually think you tell the story as you go through it, and especially when you're in a startup, it often feels like you actually do not have a story. People often say that there is a vision and there is a runway that rapidly ends, and you jump like kind of drive off that runway and try to figure out how to assemble a plane whilst you're falling. So the journey has definitely not been smooth, and I just want to encourage every young professional who thinks about it and thinks, oh, you know, people just kind of one day wake up and this is what they can say about themselves, that they're, you know, TEDx speaker, MIT 20 under 35 in Asia Pacific, you know, woman creating change in Australia and New South Wales, or whatever title might be interesting, or Amelia Earhart Fellowship that I had. All of those things, it gradually came as I was trying to achieve something that was interesting for me. And I was always fascinated by the fact that we seem to have all this data, all this different data, especially satellite imagery. And we're not really able to help people make better decisions in fundamental industries like agriculture. The way that thought came about is, of course, there is a little bit of family background. My godmother was an apiarist, so she was dealing with bees and she worked with farmers. My granddad was a civil engineer. My mom is an electronics engineer. And so there was the appreciation for science and technology around me. But I still had to make my own mark, and I still have to. It's definitely not made. So coming out of that environment, being born in Ukraine, agriculture is just so fundamental. And then living and studying in countries that are also quite heavily dependent on agriculture, like Poland, Australia. I also went to France to do an internship during my PhD, and agriculture is just constant. This is something that needs to be sorted out, whilst it constantly is in trouble if you open the news. And so for someone who preoccupies themselves with having practical application for their skills, like me, I'm particularly passionate about Earth observation. I think focusing on Earth versus the extraterrestrial focus of exploration is just something that is a bit European. As I was born and raised in that climate where Earth observation is what ESA does best, the European Space Agency. And of course, there's this big goal of sending people to different planets that largely is pursued by NASA. With that view of Earth observation, having lived in agricultural countries, and having worked in my PhD with some defense-grade remote sensing technology actually from NASA that was acquired by Australian Defense, I realized that, well, if I can in 3 years design a system that makes some sense out of this imagery on a high-altitude airplane, high-altitude drone, or correlates it to the satellite imagery, what I was building was the visual navigation system for a drone, which basically involved looking at imagery like as a human pilot would, and identifying features in that imagery and correlating the features such as the bend of the river, the roofs of the houses, the edge of the park, with those features derived in a similar way from the satellite map layer. So when you correlate what you see from your cameras on board your autonomous drone that is flying at a very high altitude, it's a military thing. When you compare it to the map, you can then identify your location and navigate from that point. And so I started my PhD with that fascination with remote sensing and trying to understand the data. And it happened so that presenting my research, I met the Defense and Science and Technology Group. They had many different names. Some of you know that. So DSTG, as it is known now, I believe. And they have given me the scholarship to pursue the practical application of my technology that I was developing the system, the visual navigation system within my PhD. And that was fascinating enough, but I didn't see that commercially I would, after my PhD, go and apply myself to that, although there were options. I now have a different status in Australia, but when I first came as a PhD student on a visa, I actually couldn't apply for that defense job, although it was kind of offered, or it was available, it was talked about. And so because I couldn't do that, I saw other opportunities. Drones were on the rise back in 2015, 16, when I was doing my PhD. And the biggest application actually I thought that was sensible was in agriculture, because this is where actually the technology can bring the real benefit that otherwise people have no way of getting. What is that benefit? For all the geeks on the call, it's not just about cool tech, and it's not just about the big picture of the farm that otherwise you cannot take by throwing your phone up high. It's actually about using specific cameras, like cameras that are sensitive to near infrared, infrared, such as thermal. So seeing the wave, like seeing, in quotes, the wavelength beyond the ones that are visible with the naked eye in RGB. And if you're able to see those wavelengths or detect them, measure them, you are able to detect the crop stress before it shows up in green and yellow and red bands. If you ever killed a plant, you know that by the time it got yellow, it was already pretty poorly, feeling pretty poorly. And so it's just to our detriment as people that we can't see certain things that the plants are making obvious to its to the other systems, even sometimes to birds or to insects. We just can't see what they're signaling. And so we can't help them early enough, and we can't adjust our approach. This idea is pretty fundamental to Earth observation in general. A Landsat program for the Landsat satellites was launched with the idea of sensing crop health. Sentinel satellite family was launched with pretty much the same idea of going more in depth. And Sentinel, that was launched in, I believe, 2015, 16, 16 it was, the data started coming back. In 2017 is when the data became operational, and they also had the second Sentinel-2 satellite coming into operation. This is where there was, I guess, the rise of the Earth observation for agriculture again, because at the Landsat resolution of 30 meters, you can't do much with a commercial field. I mean, you kind of see the broad pattern, but it's not super useful because your tractor can actually measure and manage every 8 meters or every 12 meters, not 30 meters. And so when Sentinel came online with 10-meter resolution, it was much crisper, and you could upsample that to 5. Was a bit of a stretch, but generally it makes for a good visual representation of where your field is at, even if what you're looking at is a response of the plant in near infrared. And basically, I remember having that idea when coming back from the French internship into my PhD, that I want to get involved with startups. Again, I had some professional experience in Europe before or alongside my master's, and I thought, okay, well, I'm not fully made for academia. I want to only acquire the skills, but to have the application somewhere outside of the academia. And this is how the idea originated. Then there was University of Sydney course for HDR students, high degree by research students, to explore their entrepreneurial ideas. It was called Inventing the Future. And in that course, there was a group of students who were basically searching for a problem, and I thought I already had one, and I already had a potential solution. So I was getting support from the group to validate whether that idea of making FluroSat a business would make sense. And so prototyping, sending something to, to first teachers in some agricultural department in school, later on picking up the phone and speaking to the first potential customer to even ask them, like, is this a big deal? Do you care about this? And so I remember I first called up the digital agriculture manager of one of the Australia's and actually the world's largest fertilizer input and agronomy service providers. And I had no idea that this was such a big deal, this firm. He actually picked up the phone. We scheduled a longer meeting afterwards, but he was interested. And I was like, whoa, okay, well, it's something that we can hack on our little computers with Google Earth Engine actually has legs. I want to see if it does. And so after that, I guess the journey started rolling. We had some little grants from Jobs for New South Wales. They give the MVP grant. It's $25,000 matched. So if you can manage to get $25,000 from somewhere else, like a startup accelerator or a potential customer, that technology can get a $50,000 investment. I was looking through the expense sheets for that grant. We actually spent 30,000 of those 50, if not more, on a hyperspectral camera that we put on the drone. It was a very challenging thing to actually operate, because hyperspectral cameras, they're designed to be bench devices. They're not designed to fly. And so from that experience and doing those trials more and more, I realized that it's good to be able to have everything kind of done ground up, and that we are able to fly drones or put this camera on the plane, as we did later on, and acquire the imagery to show the fundamentals of the research, that they make sense, that we can see that nitrogen deficiency in the near infrared or in red edge band or whatever wavelengths we should pick. I've published that research and kind of moved on to the actual idea I always wanted to work on, which is, if that data is available, which it now is, how would you combine the remote sensing with the agricultural modeling and with the software package, and put it in a software package that makes sense for crop advisors to receive alerts and reports and recommendations of, if the model is predicting that my cotton or wheat or corn or soy or chickpeas should be at a certain level of growth, do I see that from the satellite? Can I understand what I see from the satellite or from any plane or drone? We support basically all types of remote sensing platforms in FluroSat, in our FluroSense engine. And then we, I guess, also had the privilege of being able to attract CSIRO venture arm as a investor, which also helped us to license the APSIM technology, Agricultural Production Systems Simulator. This is arguably one of the most potent crop models that exists, and it a lot of researchers in different areas around the globe work on that model. And what it allows to do is basically build like a digital twin of the crop. If you have a little bit of information about how people started that, like how did they seeded it, did they put some fertilizer when they seeded it, and then when you connect it with remote sensing, it pretty much is a perfect marriage of the technologies, because you're able to constantly predict what the crop should be at and monitor if it's there or not, and provide the recommendations on the delta. So I guess that is there's a big dive into the story of how I got jumping between my degrees and commercial experiences, and started the company. So I guess I would like to pause here. There's a few questions that we have also prepared that I can be covered, but if there is anything that you want to hear from here, that would be super helpful as well. I don't know if we don't have a chat button, but you can raise a hand if you have a question, and then we can call out your name and you can unmute yourself. Yeah, Nick?
I have a question. First of all, congratulations on the progress that you've made. And I was going to ask you the band, the frequency bandwidth of your sensors, and you've answered that with saying it's hyperspectral. Are you recording the data on board or transmitting it to a ground station? And how is the processing? How and when is the processing done?
Yeah, so that is an interesting question. So back in the day when we were doing more of this, because FluroSat now just contracts data acquisition, we don't actually fly ourselves anymore unless we do it for some research applications when we absolutely have to have hyperspectral data. So we actually put quite a bit of effort into something that was very hard to maintain. This is why we didn't continue with it. The processing, the generation of cubes was done actually on board, and we could actually even transmit the data whilst the sensor is capturing it, to put the hyperspectral cubes aside and then to be able to stitch them before the plane lands, because that is a very heavy processing exercise in terms of the computational demand. And if everything was set up correctly in terms of the radiance sensor, which determines what is the sunlight that is present in the scene or falling on the airplane, if I guess the GPSs were perfectly collaborative with us on that day, then we would have a perfectly georeferenced hypercube. But actually, that was very hard to achieve, and the inconsistency of that data still is something that no amount of kind of on-edge, onboard processing could figure out if there were issues that it was basically hard to write tests for it. It was really hard to understand what constitutes a good data set and what constitutes a bad data set. Because automation is what we rely on when we are providing commercial service. And if this is something not scalable, then I basically made a decision that we're going to pivot in away from any data capture. Even if the hyperspectral data is very interesting, it's very useful for some crop types, it requires the manual processing later on, as well as quality assurance that currently, when we're processing millions of hectares around the globe for the users, that's just not something you can build in, because this will be the bottleneck for scaling the company if we're going to rely on that source of imagery that is quite unique. Whilst, for example, of course, Sentinel is all over the globe, so you can have it in any country, as well as the aerial imagery from other providers, so simple multispectral products that are useful for crop sensing is currently where agriculture is at. And so I guess as a researcher, someone who was coming out of research, I was really interested in seeing hyperspectral data and proving its value, and I did. But at the same time, as a business person, I've proven myself wrong that it's too early for the market to see this data. It's too early for the technologies that we have to make use of that data at the speed at which it needs to happen in agriculture. Like, everything needs to happen at such a high speed and full automation, because otherwise you just don't have the time to do it manually. And by the time you've done it, the opportunity to apply fertilizer or to spray or to adjust the irrigation cycle is gone. So that operational efficiency is what we're always chasing, with sometimes maybe even good enough quality, not an outstanding quality. So, yeah.
Okay, thank you.
Anastasia, I just had a curiosity question in that sense. So since you guys are not now manually mapping the data yourselves, but you take it from a third party, is it possible for you guys to, let's say, like locusts, something like a locust is a very big threat to agriculture in itself. Is that something you're able to detect early on because you're using a third party who has a larger coverage of area and spread? Is that something you are able to pick up or before the event happens, or is there something that's on plan, or is there something to counter it?
I get your question. So we work on crop stress detection, and we have basically one of the products of fluorescence engine is dedicated to the crop stress detection. And so this product is focused on effectively change analysis and prediction of uniformity of the field that is almost never satisfied. And so you're starting to see that, okay, if this area has a certain deficiency, if it's just close to the road, okay, just remove the road. But if it was in the area that was performing well and now for some reason it's not performing well, we're starting to we automatically detect that area. We automatically can track it over time. And we can send automated email alerts that say to the manager of that area, whether it's a crop advisor or the grower themselves, that the alert basically says there's been an area that is growing at a crop's yield's detriment, and it's currently this many acres or hectares compared to what it was before. We also identify the priority of it. If it's something that's growing very quickly and the crop health within that area is falling very rapidly compared to the crop health outside of that area, we will also assign a high priority to it. But then we need a crop advisor to actually go and check, because what you can achieve with satellite 10-meter resolution is not something you can achieve with some higher resolution imagery. So for example, if we have the airplane imagery and it's like 9-centimeter resolution in the US from our provider, this means that we can detect whether there's a irrigation nozzle on the irrigation pivot that is clogged, because we see a pattern that it makes. And we see the variability across the pivot. And all of kind of the main man-made issues are much easier to diagnose than the natural issues, because when you start damaging the crop, whether it's actually because there is a pest that's attacking it or whether it's just bad conditions, you can only see what it is over time, because the initial symptoms can be very similar. It'll be the drop in chlorophyll, the drop in vigor, but the spread of that area can tell you about the nature of it. If it's contained, then it's likely to be a soil-dependent nutrient deficiency that actually by itself can cause such issues as disease, because it's going to be prone to disease more than any other areas, and the conditions just really were such that the crop was susceptible. But you wouldn't be able to absolutely identify unless you see it. And there are some companies that focus on seeing bugs, but agronomists, crop advisors, they generally say that by the time you see it visually, it's too late to manage. It's pretty much already obvious. I should have found it myself. I don't need a drone to, go and fly that field to see the bug that I should have seen the week before. Because if that's that visual damage, this is something that they believe they are able to identify. If it's more of this invisible damage, we basically send them to that area by putting the scouting pin. They geolocate themselves and they can see, okay, I'm actually not seeing anything. Okay, I'll come next week because you will see something. It's definitely different. It might be not visible yet. Sometimes they're able to pick up some minor differences, or they even do soil tests or leaf tests. Leaf test is something you do in season. Soil test is something you do before your crop gets into full swings, because this is when you can fix things. So sometimes you would be able to see from a satellite image that it's uneven vigor and it's obvious, but if it's uneven chlorophyll, it might not be visible in the field. And so if that's such a case, people often would go and clip off leaves of the plant, put them in the bag with ice blocks, send them to the lab, get results a week later saying, okay, actually nitrates here are very high, or they did analysis on the soil acidity and they figured out that this was what causing the issue. So there's really a huge variety of things that can go wrong with the crop, and they basically all have a very similar symptom. This is actually similar to how humans work. So agriculture is very, very similar to medical space, in which, if you think about it, when the human is sick, their temperature changes. They're either very hot or they're very cold. They can be pale, but that's also a further, like later on stage of changing metabolic processes. So if you're measuring the temperature and you're like, okay, something's wrong, I also am coughing. This is very similar to a plant, when an aerial, like when a fixed wing airplane flies over the crop, like we have it in the US, and they have multispectral cameras, so RGB, near infrared, and they have thermal cameras, and that thermal camera shows us that there's crop stress because of the temperature difference. We start looking more closely on the near infrared and chlorophyll sensitive bands, because that's how you can know that something is going wrong here. Whilst in rare cases, you do not see thermal stress if there is actually something that's going wrong with the crop. Because if anything's wrong with it, it's struggling with appropriating nutrient, figuring out how to turn sunlight into carbon, and all of that leaves the plant as an excess energy, and it gets radiated. And so you're able to see that the hot plants are like hot humans. They're probably sick if they're higher temperature than what they should be. And so people manage it in different ways. There's actually obviously just heat stress, where it's just been so hot and they need more water to be cooling off by evaporative cooling. And you can adjust your irrigations based on that sensing as well. Hopefully that provides you a little bit more.
That was my question.
Yeah, excellent. Any other questions or thoughts on this stage?
Hi, I was just wondering, and you kind of touched on it just then, like considering the reliability and data acquisition, how would a CubeSat or something in orbit compare with a drone? Are there like really prohibitive resolution issues with using CubeSats, or do you just prefer to contract those third-party drone providers instead of worrying about like space and a constellation of satellites?
Yeah, thanks, Cole. That's an interesting kind of mind experiment. I think there's nothing wrong with a CubeSat, because originally even, FluroSat, out of the invent in the future, would build a model of a CubeSat to you. But that was back in the day when drones and CubeSats, I guess, just started and everyone was keen to launch one, whilst in reality, you should have a clear idea of, if you have this camera with this lens at this altitude, it gives you this resolution. And if that resolution is appealing, this is all it is about. So as long as the sensor has the sensitive bands, basically that can be achieved by either getting a specific sensor like a hyperspectral sensor, or the filtering can be done on the lenses, because camera gets all the light. It's just that we're only registering RGB light, for example, for our own purposes, whilst we can be registering thermal bands in the thermal spectrum, or we can be registering this infrared that is useful for plants. So we can assume we tweak the camera. What matters is only resolution, cost, revisit, because everything needs to have make financial sense. Like, of course, we are not just contracting drone imagery providers. And one of the reasons why the company is called FluroSat is because I believe it's ultimately from a satellite. It's from the orbit. It's not from the drone. Drone can be useful when you have an orchard. But if you have a big orchard, you already need a high resolution satellite. There is an image I'm looking at actually right now for an avocado block, northern New South Wales, and we're acquiring the high resolution satellite imagery for 50 centimeter resolution. Couldn't drone fly 50 centimeter resolution? Of course they could. They could fly 10. But it's this easy to get a high resolution satellite image. And we already established, not for all companies, like you need to have an established channel, like you need to have somewhere to get it from and know how to pay for it and have the order and processing system. But that's something that we've established. And now getting a human to get an error-prone flight in challenging weather conditions is potentially more risky than having a satellite image where you're guaranteed to not get more than 20% cloud cover. If it's more than 20% cloud cover, you don't pay for it. So that's just to kind of right back at you. Actually, I like satellites a lot more. It's just that we need to have specific cameras and resolutions that make sense. And now it's becoming more affordable. So by all means, the only challenge there is clouds. And so for some areas, like if we're monitoring, like if you're thinking of, okay, I'll launch a CubeSat, what you need to think about is like, what, if it's in a certain orbit, what areas will it be covering? If it's covering Australia, what other off orbit or opposite side continents it's going to be covering, because that data will be also very, very useful. And so, for example, if it's covering Latin America, it might not get very much data that will be useful because it's very cloudy in Brazil for a very long time. Like in India, there's the Kharif season when it's just, just rains. And this means that whatever optical imagery you're acquiring, that might not give you anything. Whilst having said that, there is a Sentinel-1, which is a radar, which is a synthetic aperture radar sensor, which is very interesting. But the amount of science you can do to understand the crop with it is a bit more limited because it's more structurally connected. So when you bounce radar off something, you kind of get the structure of it. We've done the studies that we could get the moisture of the plant because of the speed of response. Because of course, if you have like a denser plant, in terms of it holds a lot of water, then when you're bouncing a radar off it, the reflectance will be different from basically straws and sticks. If you have a drier plant, but that is very hard to differentiate in terms of like, is it a taller plant or is it actually just a more water-rich plant tissue that you're trying to sense? So I guess there are different horses for courses, I guess, and you need to choose what makes sense commercially. But I love that question.
Thank you. And I'll just also add that that's essentially the same reason why like New South Wales Rural Fire Service or Australia as a government doesn't launch satellites for bushfire detection, because it's just very cost prohibitive. Instead, they get data from NASA, which is fantastic. NASA provides satellite data twice a day, but then it's also a bit restrictive because then you only have a picture 2 times a day of what's happening in the Australian bushfire scene. So yeah, high cost and clouds and usage is a big issue. But thank you for answering my question.
Yeah, it's definitely a big thing, and a lot of companies or a lot of like, small startups that started looked at that fire issue. Even when we started FluroSat, the very first or second deck about market opportunity also included fire service, but then you quickly get to realize that you almost have to have like an hourly update with something like MODIS, which is a much low resolution but higher revisit satellite. So you get a lot more images per unit time, whilst you have kind of a general idea of the direction of the trend. So I think that's always a trade-off, resolution versus revisit, and the cost on top of that. Great. Any other questions? Tim?
Yeah, I'll ask a question. Thanks, Anastasia, for giving us your time to share your experiences. Really enjoyed hearing what you've learned so far in your journey. So my question is, so leading up to how you founded FluroSat, where would you consider to be your greatest pieces of learning and contributed to the success? Like, you have this great repertoire of learning qualifications for entrepreneurship and leadership, and you've also got the hands-on experience through your internships and leadership involvement. But so what would be your advice for like young entrepreneurs in like whether we should value the learning from educational institutions such as universities or more from the hands-on practical experiences like internships?
Yeah, thank you for that question, Tim. Someone who has one too many degrees cannot probably teach academia too much, because there's definitely a reason why I got all of those degrees. But I think that's just an insatiable desire to learn and to make a contribution. So I think I didn't feel like in my master's I made a contribution. I didn't stop doing everything that I was doing just to do my degree. That's one thing that I think you need to take into account when you're hearing my answer, because I never really chose. I was choosing for a while, but then I was still keeping other things open. Like when I was studying at Sydney Uni in my first year, I was tutoring robotics at Museum of Applied Arts and Sciences, which is powerhouse in Sydney, and that allowed me to do some Mars robotic simulations with kids from schools, and that was awesome to learn how they set it up and work with actually fellow students from ACFR, Australian Institute of Field Robotics at Sydney Uni, who were my colleagues at academically. We did like a reading group together during PhD hours. So it's a big pool. When you have an interest, you just trying to extend that interest to cover it from all the different perspectives. But I think if I were to give advice on this, I think academic knowledge isn't, you're not just doing your studies so you know how to memorize something and feed it back at people. I think certain disciplines, if you want to be an aeronautical engineer, you just need to know what are kind of the intuitive things you need to keep in mind, like that there is a stress testing involved, there is a heat and mass balance, and there's all these things that need to be taken into account when you're thinking of a system, whatever that system will be, what you want to do. So I think becoming an entrepreneur out of the blue is very hard. Becoming the entrepreneur out of the technical knowledge that something is possible, and seeing the business opportunity that you've gone and validated, not just like, I think this will be a good idea, people will buy it. My most practical advice would be find 30 people who you can ask this question with the price and price tag attached to it, and the detailed question that you can ask around how it would fit into their workflow, would they adopt it? And if everyone's absolutely saying, yes, we want to hear more from you, we're really obsessed with this problem, this is where you have your right group. Because startup science is a science on itself, and you can read a lot from the fathers of the startup logic. There is minimum viable product logic. There is a lot of like Steve Blank would be, he's the main guru in startup, kind of structuring your startup and understanding how to build one. And there is this pyramid. What are the type of users that you're looking for when you're, for example, trying to build your own venture? It's not just the users who have the problem and are interested in the solution, but there's actually like the top of the pinnacle of that pyramid is the users who've actually tried to build a solution on their own, because they will understand, like they are so driven to solve this problem. They've even tried to do it themselves without having the skills. Like they might be, a doctor and they were trying to build a robot for screening, or they might be a farmer and they tried to build the drone camera, or like the IoT. Farmers often tinker with IoT, or they used to. Like there's lots of stories always when you rock up to a farm and they're actually hooking up their own network that they developed themselves, and it's like, wow. Like these are the people who really see the problem and see the reason to solve that problem with their time. And those are the people who, if you offer them your solution and they say, this is better, I want to get stuck into it with you to help you figure this out, this is when you have potentially an appealing proposition. And that knowledge, from what I just said, doesn't come from university. It comes from the real world application. And so I was taking free internships. I was working, as a business development manager for a startup that was in the space that I was passionate about, also just language and learning. And they're doing really well now as well. So that's on my LinkedIn profile anyway. But I guess if you're passionate about acquiring some knowledge, why are you doing it? Are you trying to solve a problem? You might as well learn about the practical implications of those problems, whether it's, for example, going into aviation industry or doing something with the data that comes from remote sensing. Fantasizing about serving an industry without knowing too much about it is not very practical. So instead, combining that knowledge and meeting the people, I have a lot of people who reach out to me and they talk about things like, I'm an inspiring data scientist, and I discovered satellite data, and I'm trying to do this project by pulling just different resources of GitHub, etc. Would you mind giving me advice on this in an email. And sometimes I would, if I'm able to, I would take a call and have a conversation with that person saying that it's really phenomenal that you decided that satellite imagery was it, and we want more data scientists and satellite working with satellite imagery, period. So we can advise where to get data sets, so we can get them a dump of data set into their like Dropbox. And we've done this because I think it's in this general direction of paying it forward. You need to kind of see where you can fit into that, right, Tim? Like if you want to reach out to an expert who has a specific domain knowledge that you're passionate about that, and if you want to solve the pressing problems in that, I think the problem looks always very different from the outside than it is from the inside, and delivering any solution is actually spending 90% of understanding the problem. So that would be my advice.
Thank you so much for that. Would you be okay if I were to, like, such as through the example that you gave, contact you through email to ask you some questions in regards to some of the research problems that I'm sort of encountering?
That's Anastasia at FluroSat.com, or Mitch can give you my email.
I
I
think
we have
later.
that enabled
might be
here, but
good.
yeah, that'd be good.
Thank you so much.
That's no problem. We have a few minutes left. I'm happy to take more questions in a little bit more time, if we can take 2 more exciting questions if we have them.
Any volunteers? Any questions?
Or we can just finish on time. That's great too.
Anastasia, just before we finish, just a small question maybe. Just sort of curiosity, what would be the frequency that you can acquire images from and provide to, like, for example, let's say if you have Sentinel giving you the image frequency at maybe every 1 hour, and what would be the sort of the response time that you would process the image and pass it on to your customer? Like, what's the minimum and the maximum latency, you can say?
Yeah, cool. So Sentinel normally comes in every 3 to 4 days, depending on location. That's generally what you would expect. Sometimes 5 days. If it's cloudy, it can be like once in 2 weeks, or once a month even. Last year was very rainy in the US and very much drought in Australia. So it was pretty much the coin flipped. One continent had imagery every 3 to 4 days, whilst the other one had all the imagery being cloudy. So having said that, once the imagery is acquired, it really depends. We have services now, like we're testing the latest service that allows us to get the imagery over the course of the entire year in 20 seconds.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, and deliver products at the back of that. Whilst currently, we're operating more on the, it's all a cost benefit ratio. Currently, we're running the services that allow us to process this over the course of the few hours. So every 3 or 4 hours, we built the tasks queue of all of these new satellite tiles that intersects with these fields and farms. Therefore, go and generate products for them. Once you generated products and vegetation indices, generate the derivative products, which are the crop performance, crop stress, or crop nutrition model inputs or recommendations. And then that gets to the customer. So this can take anywhere from 30 minutes to 4 hours, depending on when are we in that cycle of renewing the imagery and looking for it again. But generally, that's what we learned about agriculture. It has to be under 12 hours to be useful.
Yep, that
ideally under 4. Yeah. Okay. Excellent. Well, if no one raises their hand now or has a question, then we are out of time, and I get to go and have my dinner and continue working.
Thank you, Anastasia.
Do you have a question or just a comment?
I just wanted to say thank you for that. It was very interesting.
Excellent. Really enjoyed connecting with you all.
Thank you.
Thank you,
See you again
guys.
in the future.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Guys. Thanks, Anastasia.
Thank you,
Thank
guys.
you very
Bye.
much.